Great. So, welcome. Like I said, my name is Foluke Fadare, and I'm an evaluation specialist that works all across sub Saharan Africa. I also volunteer as a member of faculty at the Learning Hub, and we're pleased to welcome you this evening to our weekly webinar. This week, I'm the one hosting the webinar, and like I said, Foluke Fadare. Yeah, so what's the Learning Hub about? The Learning Hub is online academy that is focused mainly on the training for monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning practitioners. And we also run a consultancy service called Evidence Analytics and Insight. So the Learning Hub is an offshoot of the consultancy service, but the Learning Hub is strictly for training on monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning, and also for communications and program management that is focused on the social development, or what some would call the international development sector, mostly in Nigeria, but we also have people who participate in our training from all over sub Saharan Africa. So, usually, most Fridays, we have a webinar as part of our regular training. So, this webinar is actually targeted at people that are in our training cohort, but we open it to everybody at no charge. And so, this week's webinar is one of the regular ones that we have. And we usually have members of faculty lead these webinars, or we have guest speakers who come on board and share about their experiences as monitoring and evaluation practitioners, or researchers, or knowledge management experts, or people who do other work in program management, in communications within the social development sector. So today we're going to be talking about the theory of change. I like to move directly because we don't have so much time. It's a 1 hour webinar and it's going to be strictly on for 1 hour. We're going to be looking at what a theory of change is, first of all, because sometimes as development practitioners or as male professionals, we get to hear of it, the theory of change, or we come into a project or a program and the theory of change is already developed. So we just see either a diagram or a narrative and they say the theory of change. In some instances, we never hear of the theory of change, or we never see the theory of change because one wasn't developed. A project was just set up by listing out objectives and what you want to achieve with it. And so nobody really sat down to develop the theory of change. For some others, you have a theory of change, but it is not well socialized. So the members of the team do not know what it is. It's only really senior colleagues or those who design the project that understand what that theory of change is. So we're going to break it down to understand what the theory of change means. We're also going to be looking at how we can use the theory of change to set up effective monitoring and evaluation processes, and how to develop one. So it's not just, oh, this is a theory of change, but how do you develop a theory of change? And we'll also point you to tools and strategies that you can use when you want to develop one of your own. And there will be a live question and answer at the end. So if you have any questions for me as we run through the session, just keep them and or pop them into the chat box and we'll get to it at the end. Like I said, my name is Foluke Fadare. I work as a development specialist. I've worked in projects across all of sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in parts of East Asia. I've worked for organizations in the UK and in the US. I currently work with the British Council in Nigeria as the Senior Evaluation Advisor for Sub-Saharan Africa, and I volunteer at the Learning Hub. Okay, so going into the meat of the matter, what is a theory of change? The textbook definition that you'll get is what you have on the slide deck. That is, it's some sort of systematic or structured document with which you use to describe a project, or you use to illustrate what a project is going to be doing and what you want to achieve with that project. By project, I mean a development intervention, and what you want to achieve, taking into context everything that is happening around the project and what you want to see over the lifespan of the project. So, ideally, that's what a theory of change is. In my personal definition, I call it the trajectory of change that you want to see over time happening within your project. So when you have a theory of change, you use it to describe the step-by-step process of what's going to be happening and what you want to see result from what is happening. So if you're going to do a particular intervention, and over the course of this 1 hour, I'll be using different types of interventions, because in the monitoring and evaluation space, we work over different things. Some people work in health, some people work in education, some people work in agriculture, some people work on livelihoods. So we'll bring in different contexts so you understand better and you can apply what we're saying to your project. So usually you would describe the activities that you would deliver step by step when you're going to deliver them. And you also want to describe what you are going to achieve in the immediate term and in the long term. So you want all of that described in a theory of change. And your theory of change could be presented as a diagram, which is often, more often than not, you would see a theory of change as a diagram. Sometimes you would see it as a narrative, so just a strong description of what the project is going to do. And if someone is really exceptional, or the team that is working on the theory of change is really exceptional, they would do both. They would have a diagrammatic representation of the theory of change, as well as an accompanying narrative to explain what is in the diagram. And it's commonly used during the program design stage. So there's a lot of brainstorming that is done before a program is designed. So what you should have as an output from those brainstorming sessions ideally should be your theory of change, your logic model or some sort of framework, as well as your work plan for implementation and your monitoring and evaluation plan. So those are the things that you ideally use to start off your project before you go into your project charter and all that, if we're going into strong program management terms. Yeah. So this should be the outputs of those early or initiation stages of your program or your project. And we also use it in the evaluation space, because it's, if you do it well, it serves as the standard against which your project is measured. So most really good organizations or highly functional organizations will start an intervention by designing a strong theory of change, and then use that for program implementation as well as for monitoring and evaluation and planning. So it's used a lot in the social development or international development sector. And yeah, what are the things that, the components that make up a theory of change, or what does it help us to do? First of all, it describes the causal analysis. When we say causal analysis, we're thinking of the background investigation that has gone into why we are doing the project, and how the project is going to evolve, as well as how those things that we want to see, how they are going to happen and why they are going to happen. So there's something that sometimes is missing in how we describe our projects. It's the why is this going to happen. So if, for instance, you are on a nutrition project and you want to see young babies improve their weight, their birth weight, you want to, because maybe there has been a history of malnutrition, low birth weight and infant mortality in a particular community, and you're bringing in an intervention that addresses that through nutrition. Sometimes you just explain, oh, we're going to supply some sort of nutrition supplement, we're going to educate mothers, we're going to educate mother-in-laws, we're going to educate grandmothers, we're also going to educate men. And what we expect to see is that men are more supportive. We expect to see that grandmothers provide the right guidance to their granddaughters, mothers to their daughters, sorry, grandmothers of the infants provide better education to their daughters. Mother-in-laws do the same thing. They're more involved. They're less likely to hold on to beliefs that do not support proper nutrition. So we're able to categorize our project. We're able also to categorize what we want to see because we're implementing those activities. But sometimes we do not capture why we expect that change to happen. So, for instance, why do we expect the grandmothers to influence their daughters or their daughters in law? Why do we expect men to be more supportive of their wives after we have provided them with some education? So, that cause, what is causing the change? What is triggering change? Let's say you're on a health project that is looking at stopping cigarette smoking and reducing tobacco use or reducing HIV spread. there's something, in spite of the education that is happening, there's something that triggers the individual that is in your project to make that change of changing their health habit. So we're going to be looking at those things that help us to understand what is causing change in the theory of change. So that's why we say there's a causal analysis that happens when you are designing the theory of change. There's also a program mapping that happens when you design the theory of change based on evidence, based on beliefs, or the assumptions that you make about the community or the people you are working with. You tend to map out how your project is going to happen, what activities you're going to do, the time you're going to do it, why you are going to do it at that time, what you expect to happen because you're doing it at that time. And because you have that, you are able to categorize your project activities and your inputs and have a timeline for project delivery. And because you have now done these two things, you've tried to identify the causes of change that will happen in your project, as well as map out your project activities, you can articulate what your expectations will be. So you can say that, oh, because I'm doing this intervention, I'm going to achieve these outcomes or these goals. And ideally, your theory of change is supposed to be rooted in evidence. So going back to the point I made earlier about having a causal analysis, the causal analysis is based, should be based on existing evidence. So something that has been scientifically established on why that change happens. It should also be embedded in your theory of change. So the theory part of a theory of change, it means to. So, hi again, everyone. I just got feedback that we missed some questions. I'm not sure why that happened. Probably there was a delay with my internet, so I didn't get the questions on my end, and I really apologize. So, I want to do a short video on the questions. I think there are about three of them, and they can send them out to everyone who attended. The first question is, how do you integrate learning and change management into a theory of change? I'd say the first thing to do is to make sure that you're providing for feedback loops and there's some sort of system for incorporating continuous feedback at different stages of the project. So this comes in your project planning and work planning. So you could have your feedback could be regular evaluations or regular monitoring, feedback from your stakeholders, input from your participants, so project participants or beneficiaries, so that you know it's not based on a whim. You know, it's based on solid evidence that there's a need for you to change your theory or your program design. And this way you enhance the theory of change. So when you have this feedback loops built in, it gives you the opportunity for reflective practice. So sometimes for some projects, you would have these retreats that happen where you go off into some place, have a nice trip, and you should also be using those sessions to look at your theory of change. So if you're the M&E person on the team, in preparing for those sessions, you should be using your theory of change to say all the evaluations we've gotten so far, all the monitoring feedback we've gotten, information from our participants, from our stakeholders, when you look at it against our theory of change, this is where it positions us. And these are the possible next steps that we can take because of all these insights that we have. So, having that culture of reflection is very important. It's a short term project. I would say build it into your monitoring cycles. Some short term projects will have quarterly monitoring cycles. So after those cycles have happened and you have a good monitoring report, pull your team into a reflective practice and look at how that report is, juxtapose the report against your theory of change and see what you can change, what you need to do better, where you're even doing great, and you can pivot on the greatness that you have been able to achieve. If it's a longer term project, so let's say it's a 3-year project, have a midterm review, which should be about a year and a half or 2 years into project delivery, so that you can take stock and ask yourself really pertinent questions. This, for instance, this methodology that we're using, does it work? The assumptions we have based our project on, do they hold true? All those things, think about them and see if you need to adjust in how you deliver your project activities or in how you are working with people. So your processes, you may need to adjust that. If it's a longer term project, like maybe a 5 year project, I'd say annual reviews. Do that so that you can take stock before you go into the next year of implementation. And if you're on a donor funded project, usually your donors request for these reviews because they also understand the importance of you staying on the right course so that they can help you to achieve those outcomes that they want to see. And like I said before, use data. So either qualitative data or quantitative data, depending on what insights you want, how much you have available to do your evaluations or your monitoring work. So use data to inform the relevance of your assumptions and the pathways that you are taking in your theory of change, and be regular on your assessment. Build it assessment in to the point where it's everybody's job to do monitoring and evaluation. It's everybody's job to gather data, and because they're doing it, they're very conscious of, oh, what's the data telling us, so you can use all that to track and see if you're achieving your desired outcomes. And the change management part of the question, if you do need to put in a serious change because something is not going as you have theorized in your theory of change, make sure that you're carrying your stakeholders along. Actively involve them in any discussion that you're going to have about changing your theory of change. Request for their insights because it will help you to identify what else you can do. They may be looking at things from a higher level than you are. They could also facilitate connections for you, network on your behalf, open doors for you that help you to resolve the issues that you would like to address. Also, don't forget that your community is your stakeholder. So make sure that whatever change that you're doing is in alignment with your community needs and their expectations for your project. Also, if you're working with government, make sure that your government stakeholders are carried along. And communicate within your communication plan. Hopefully you have one for your project. Try to also make room to articulate when you're changing things around your theory of change. Articulate that to all your stakeholders. Explain why you are making the changes and how the changes that you're making help you to align better with your larger scale project goals. And make sure that everybody has the right capacity. If there's going to be change management, there has to be capacity within your team. Sometimes the change is because processes are not implemented as they should be implemented. So I wouldn't say empty your team. I would say offer the right training and the right resources so that your teammates build the skills that they need so that your change management is successful and that they really understand the theory of change. Everybody on your team, every single person, from the topmost person to the least, should understand your theory of change. If somebody randomly stops them on the staircase to ask, what's your project about? The smallest, the youngest person, the least qualified person on your team should be able to discuss your theory of change really, really well with your staff that are not on your project, but in your organization, with your partners, with your stakeholders, with your community members, because it means that they know what they are supposed to do, and it helps with ensuring that the changes, the adjustments that you're making are implemented effectively. So I hope I have addressed that question. The next question is, can you change the theory of change while in the middle of project implementation? Yes, 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 you can. A theory of change, like that starting word, is a theory. It's not concretized, it's not fixed in stone. So it's possible for you to change the theory of change in the midst of project implementation. And sometimes it's really, really necessary. If you find out that things are not going well at all, you may need to really do a whole review of the project. I remember once working on an education project and our beneficiaries were not interested in delivery in receiving the project. Yeah. So we had to do a lot of mental, what's the word, stimulation and training on the value of our project to the beneficiaries that had already been selected. So that was not in the original plan, but that had to be done. So this question around adaptive management and change management is important. We must embrace it, that it doesn't have to go as per the work plan. Sometimes there's need for us to look at our initial assumptions? Do we need to revisit them and make adjustments? And like I said, it should always be based on evidence, it should be based on learnings, and on if the context is changing in the communities where you are working. So always assess the contextual environment. So, is there a shift in policy, for instance? Is there a demographic change? Has a war happened? So, is something different happening that you hadn't thought of before? Also, in the underlying theory, so the research or the guidelines or the models that you have based your work, is there something new about it that helps you to achieve your outcomes better? So keep your eyes out, be aware of things that are happening, so that when changes happen in the context, you may need to revisit or reevaluate your theory of change and make sure that it stays relevant and effective. I've already said it, take your stakeholders along in everything you're doing, because it helps them be to take up more of to have more of an ownership spirit. And stakeholders, now I'm talking of lower stage stakeholders, government, your implementing communities, community leaders. It's if you're going to change anything in your theory of change, letting them know helps them to understand the new direction. It promotes buy-in. They feel like, oh, they're being considered in decision making, which is quite important. Another question, a very huge one, is, does funding play any role in developing a theory of change? Yes, in developing a theory of change, in implementing your theory of change is all based on funding. Funding, because the amount of money you have is very critical. If you don't have money, how do you think that's like the money be five bob? So if you don't have money, you can't do as much as you would. Imagine that you're basing a training project on a training model that involves encountering teachers 4 different times. So you need to provide 4 different training sessions to teachers before they have the full capacity to support their learners. And you don't have money for 4 different training sessions. Training sessions involve sometimes transport support, meals, venue, paying for the person that's going to do the training. You don't have money for 4 different sessions. So you decide that, okay, what we're going to do is we'll crash what is supposed to be session one and session two. We'll crash those into one training session. And then what's supposed to be session three and session four, we crash into another training session. So we will now have 2 training sessions rather than four. There's a likelihood that your training sessions will be packed. You're not able to transfer knowledge as well as you would like. So you should be cautious that the outcomes that you would get from delivering the 4 training sessions as stipulated in your model will not be the same as the outcomes you would get in your delivery of 2 training sessions as necessitated by funding available. So things just change because you have less funds. You can't expect the same kind of outcomes. Another thing about funding is, if it is a donor funded project or program, your donor actually dictates the direction in which you go. There's room for you to do things, but the larger thinking and the impact that they want to see is almost specified. So in that sense, in developing your theory of change, I remember I spoke about the top to bottom theory of change. So it's dictated by your donor if you already have an impact that you are building up to. So you are working from that top impact level that the donor has created down to what your community expects. But I think I must caution what I'm saying to say, if from designing your theory of change, there's the likelihood that you won't get as much impact in following a regimented direction, then speak to your donor about it so that they know that there's a better way of doing things. After this of course is after you have engaged with your communities, or with governments. Also, donor fund of not donor funding generally affects how you invest in evaluation. I've worked for an organization before where they said, oh, we don't have so much money, cut back on project activity. The first thing to always go is evaluation. I don't know why, very sad. But yeah, if you don't have sufficient funding, then you can't do comprehensive monitoring and evaluation, and you can't have the insights that you need to inform your theory of change. This could be development or the implementation of it or the refinement of it. So money is very, very critical. And you want people to have the right capacity to implement your theory of change, don't you? So making sure that your team has the right capacity to execute activities, to do all the tasks, they can deliver processes as they should be delivering. That is very important. So if you don't have money to make sure that you have the right capacity within your team, then there's a problem. So yes, funding is important for all, for everything, I feel, when it comes to developing the theory of change, how far your project can go, what your project can achieve, and the people that are going to deliver on that theory of change. Funding is really, really important. So, yeah, those are the questions that we got. Once again, thank you to everyone for joining. And I really apologize that I didn't get to the questions while we were on live, because the promise was that it was going to be a live question and answer. I'm really sorry about that. But I hope I answered everyone's questions well. And I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Bye. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.